We are ready to start.
I have bad internet connection.
Yes. So,
Do you have a good?
testing. Let's. Great. Hi, everybody, and thanks for coming to this panel, a really important panel, we think, and hopefully you will too at the end, on tackling trolls and managing online harassment. In the age of Trump, we're adding, because there is an actual connection to the escalation of the sort of harassment that's being experienced, particularly among women globally. It's going to be a difficult discussion at times, and it might bring up experiences that you would like to share, so we're going to try and get to as many questions as we can. I think it's really important to encourage an environment where people feel safe to acknowledge the kind of harassment that they might have experienced. So please speak up if you'd like to add something at any point. I'm going to start, though, setting the scene in a pretty dismal way, I apologise, quoting from an OSCE study from 2015 that examined the particular experiences of women journalists in terms of online harassment. I was raped in the imaginations of many men, and in so many different ways they've expressed their interest in doing that in person. Also, they've promised to do the same to my mother. That was just one respondent out of many to this study that was launched at the end of 2015. And I'm going to start by giving an overview of some of the global research and insights that have been curated over the past 2 or 3 years as this issue has become more traction-worthy, I guess, within newsrooms, but certainly within civil society as well. And it's really worthwhile acknowledging that we are in, a golden age for audience-engaged journalism, and that's fundamentally important. And we encourage our journalists and freelancers as well to be active participants in online communities as a way of distributing content, as a way of ensuring that there is a sense of agency for our audiences. But online harassment is indeed a growing problem. It's an issue that is confronted by both men and women. We don't want to discount the fact that it's experienced by men, but as some of the evidence I'll present now demonstrates, it is much worse and frequently much more sexualised and violent in nature when it comes to women journalists. So the sexual harassment and the graphic threats of physical violence are the indicators for the kind of harassment that is typically experienced by journalists. Before I go any further, I just want to interview this rather amazing panel of women we've gathered here. We might at some point have a man joining us in the form of Greg Barber from the Washington Post, who's done a lot of work in online comment spaces. So if he pops up and starts to participate in the conversation, don't condemn him, he's been invited. But can I start at my right, Alexandra Pascalidou, who's a very prominent Swedish journalist whose story I will let her reveal when we get to this point. It is compelling, and I met Alexandra at a conference that the EU pulled together examining some of the issues in contemporary journalism, and I walked away in tears and with a sense of passion and urgency about this issue that I hadn't felt before. Mary Hamilton, to my left, who's a very experienced and high-profile journalist from The Guardian. She's the executive editor of Audience. Is that still your title at The Guardian? To my immediate right is Blanid Healy, who is the senior digital editor with CNN Digital, senior digital news editor. And last but not least, Hannah Storm, who's the executive director of the International News Safety Institute. So we're going to try and tackle some of these issues. We want ultimately to have a discussion that prompts action, that looks at solutions. But as I said, we need to scope the problem first. So the problem that we're talking about, particularly when it comes to women, is often described as cyber misogyny. So it can be expressed through online abuse and harassment, stalking, for example, but it's also potentially a threat that crosses over into the physical realm. And it's a genuine risk, whether it's online or offline, a genuine risk to journalists' psychological health, as well as potentially their physical health. And I'm emphasising psychological health because for too long we've told journalists, just look away. It's not real, it's only on the internet. And I think that's something we need to acknowledge as a problem. It can be a particularly brutal experience for journalists, particularly women, who are reporting on feminist issues, tech issues, and Mary's going to talk a little bit more about this, politics, social policy issues. So if you're at the intersection of reporting on race and politics and you're a woman, you're more likely to be a target for this kind of harassment. There's an early quote from these debates from an email that Jezebel staff sent to executives at Gawker that really still resonates with me. One of the journalists says, "It's like playing whack-a-mole with a sociopathic hydra." In other words, you just can't push that thing away. And she said, on behalf of her colleagues, it's impacting our ability to do our jobs. So from a newsroom management perspective and from the perspective of the role of journalism in democracy, this is a huge issue, yeah? So women feeling often that they need to walk away or that they have to withdraw either from online communities or from a particular round. Some of the research indicates that women are leaving the profession altogether or not entering the profession. And it's also causing women in audiences to pull back from participation, and sources as well. So it goes on to affect civil society discourse and the sort of agency that's required for a civil society. So let's look at some of the research. There was a study, quite seminal study in this area from 2014 done by Demos in the UK. And it studied Twitter specifically and the abuse of celebrities. And what this study found was that journalism was the only category where women received more abuse than men, with female journalists receiving roughly 3 times the abuse levels as their male counterparts. I think things have shifted since then, but that's an early indicator of where the problem was emerging. That OSCE study, look it up, it's really helpful, it's full of detail, from 2015, found that among the journalists who were surveyed, 90 to 95% of the experience of harassment occurred online within that group. So, we spent several decades ago when I started as a journalist, we spent a lot of time and energy looking at physical sexual harassment and verbal sexual harassment in the newsroom. Still a huge issue, but this is the kind of statistic we're seeing in terms of online engagement. And the study found that female journalists, bloggers, and other media actors are disproportionately experiencing gender-related threats and intimidation and harassment on the web, and that it has a direct impact on their safety and future online activities. There's a range of recommendations from that study, a call to action for news organisations, for individual journalists, for civil society groups, and we'll get to some of those issues later. But to summarise the sorts of threats that they discovered through this research, they included death threats. They included the threats of rape and violence that we hear so much about. They included threats to harm the children of some of the reporters. Hacking through email and Skype specifically, and social accounts. One that's really troubling, and young journalists who I've taught previously are experiencing this through Tinder interactions, but the creation of fake profiles on dating sites designed to direct harassment at women journalists, for example. There were reports of dead bodies being sent to journalists. I have a friend who's a feminist writer in Australia who works for my organisation as a columnist, and she has received pictures, archival pictures of dead bodies as a way of trying to silence her, and that's revealed in this research as well. Also, blog posts, that go viral, defaming individual journalists, and even newspaper ads in some cases being taken out against the reporters following an onslaught of online activity. And one of the other interesting points was that the foreign correspondents who responded to this research talked about the fact that they knew they were at risk of this kind of harassment physically in the field in certain contexts. They didn't expect to feel victimised in the way that they did when they came home to their domestic newsrooms. I know that we probably don't need much more, but just to highlight the fact that this is not an issue only confronting women journalists or journalists specifically, but the UN Broadband Commission found in 2016 that 3/4 of women online have been exposed to some sort of cyber violence, and they've urged governments and industry to work harder to protect women and girls online to ensure their participation. And an issue that we'll get to that has emerged since the US election campaign through the the discussion around the graphic sexism that was revealed in connection with Donald Trump, and I don't want to politicise this too much, but the effective licensing of the harassment of women that occurred with online harassment attacks on women journalists and women commentators, anyone who spoke up. You know, the attacks began to be sexualised. So I don't think I actually introduced myself, which is hilarious. I've only had one espresso, so forgive me. I just realised that I'm talking about everybody else. My name is Julie Pizzetti. I'm an Australian journalist and academic, and I work at Fairfax Media, which is the biggest publisher of news in Australia. And in that capacity, I work there in the capacity of the lead on digital editorial capability. So these are issues that I'm not just researching and talking about, but also trying to respond to in a practical way through training. So let's get this discussion properly underway now that we've created that pretty depressing picture of global experience. I'm just going to ask each member of the panel for their reflections on experiencing online harassment, whether it be individually or in the context of a newsroom in the course of their work. And I'm going to start with Alexandra, who also has a video that I think we might see at some point. So Alexandra, the way you've explained your particular experience actually starts from having been a migrant child in Sweden and experiencing harassment from, you know, your upbringing through to your role in the newsroom. Can you just take us through your story?
Yes. Good morning. Would you like me to show the short film now, or? Yeah, we can start with it if you like to hear. Does it? And what about the voice?
If you don't leave the country within 24 hours, we will kill you and your family. When this anonymous letter arrived through a letterbox, I was a 9-year-old nobody. I came to Sweden at the age of 6. My father was a Greek migrant, a cleaner. We lived in a suburb mainly inhabited by refugees and migrants, in a family without books or newspapers. My mother took the letter and went to the police. When she came back, she said, "There is nothing they can do because the threat is anonymous." I'm grateful and privileged to work as a journalist in Sweden. Since my first day at work 20 years ago, I've been called a whore, a slut, a bloody foreigner, a disgusting migrant, a Jewish, gypsy, Muslim whore. They've been telling me they will cut my tongue off, they will cut my fingers off, they will break my knees. I should kill myself, or they will kill me. They've been telling me to go home, or they will send me home. They've been threatening me with gang rapes and sexual torture. There are times when I wake up with verbal violence and fall asleep to sexist, racist rage echoing in my head. When I went to the police, they said, "There is nothing we can do. The threat is anonymous." Unfortunately, I'm not alone. I'm one of millions. People that fear for their lives, feel unprotected.
You can watch the rest. It's only 3 minutes or something. It's so interesting to be here. Thank you so much for your invitation, Julie. And it's also very revealing to see who are here. The majority are women. We only have a couple of men here. And I think there should be more men attending this seminar. You know what I mean? Because this is so much, I mean, there are like millions of women around the world that are daily being harassed, humiliated, threatened by mostly men. They are the ones sending all threats just to silence women. And I could talk about this for a long time, but I happen to be a migrant, and I stood up for being, of Greek origin. I stood up for being a woman. I stood up for being from a working class family in the poorest suburb of Sweden. It was called a ghetto, and I stood up for all of these things, being a journalist, doing TV shows and so on. And from the first day, and now it's been like 20 years, and every day I've been receiving these kinds of threats. And they varied. They could write to me, "We killed our Prime Minister Olof Palme, you're next." They could write to me that, "We know exactly what time you take the metro to your job. We'll wait for you there." And they came to libraries when I gave speeches about my books. They took photos, and the last time they did it, it was a year ago. And things got worse because somehow I got used to this. I had like Nazis outside my home with weapons and masks, and we went to court because they were caught, and it was the first time that the police put effort in catching them, in doing something. But I was lucky at that time, and I even wrote a book about that. And why do I say I was lucky? Because these Nazis, they made a big mistake. They didn't only threaten me at that time, they also threatened the head of the police force, the spokesperson. So I think that was one reason that the police took it so seriously. So through the years, I've been totally, devastated, but I never took time off, I never stopped, because I think that, I think it's my duty, being who I am, to keep fighting, to stand up, and to be a role model for young girls and young immigrants, and fight for pluralism and democracy. It's a privilege to be a journalist, and I think it comes with a duty. But last time, things just get worse, because for me, this situation was reality long before we talked about online harassment. They came to my home, they called me, but now it's getting even worse. And also because I have an 8-year-old daughter, and sometimes she joins me at work, when I give public speeches and so on. And nowadays the threats are also about her, what they will do to her. And being a single mother, I live alone. I also belong to the more vulnerable group of being a freelance journalist, which means you never know, you don't have anybody who's responsible for your safety. You don't know when you will get your next job, and there are periods when, bosses at different media, radio, TV, they don't really dare to work with you because they fear for their lives. And I can't expect that they should be as dedicated to this fight as I am. You know what I mean? And I think that the worst part is what has happened as a consequence is, of course, the lack of democracy and the freedom of speech, because what we start doing, many of us, is self-censorship. We don't really dare to say things, we don't dare to respond, we don't dare to say things that should be certainties in Europe or in the world 2017. The only thing I need to say on Twitter, on Instagram, something to have reactions like that, harassment and humiliation and lies, is to say simple things as talk about human equality, things like that. And people go crazy. And I also think that, what was I going to say now? I tried to do my best to lie for my daughter and for the other kids, but of course they understand what's happening, and of course she lives a life where she can't open the door, where she we would sit at home Saturday night, and we have like racists and Nazis coming to our door, our home door. There is some kind of like a mailbox in a hole when they put their Nazi newspaper with me on pictures from that library where they came. Or the other day, I was at a restaurant with a friend of mine where we were surrounded by Nazis. And the worst thing is that every time I go to the police, they say, we can't do anything. And so then you're totally alone with this. And even if you complain or point out the situation, they humiliate you even more. They're like, oh, she's a professional victim, you know what I mean? And they also try to present you as being paranoid, or so it's, you know, sometimes you feel like, you know, like all these raped girls that are, you know, being seen as they provoked the rapes. So you feel like you're guilty even if you're not. So about this self-censorship, but also this hatred that poisons you so much that after a while you start hating yourself. Because living with this echo of sexist and racist and, you know, all these attacks day and night, and not only from keyboard warriors, anonymous guys, you know, sitting there being frustrated because they're unemployed or whatever. That's also a stereotype. But also famous, very powerful politicians, you know, respected men and artists who feed and nurture and nourish this hatred. And, you know, sometimes I also avoid to call them trolls, because trolls, they exist in fairy tales. These guys are nightmares. And these guys, we should call them for what they are. They are racists, they are sexists, they are homophobes, they're anti-Semite, they're Islamophobes. You know what I mean? I think that trolls sometimes doesn't tell the whole truth. There are so many things from my own life that I could tell you, and I've written books about it, and I've written articles about it, and everything. And I really, really struggle not to give in, not to give up. And it's a daily struggle because I don't have anybody to back me up or to support me. I try to support younger girls by, you know, inviting them for small meetings and so on. And, you know, I'm pretending, and that keeps me strong and alive, and that keeps me in this profession. I pretend I'm stronger than I am. Do you know what I mean? And it's a great way of manipulating yourself, to think that you're stronger and that there's a bigger goal, a bigger mission, and that this is not about me. This is not a personal matter. It's not, I'm just one of millions, and we are together in this, and we really have to fight this together. And today, I'm thinking of, like, I'm sitting here, you know, I'm like white, you know, I'm European, I'm Greek, and I'm thinking, and I've met girls around the world and women, it's even worse for them. You know, being black, for example, in Europe today, or being a Muslim, I mean, I really hope that we can start something from today, some kind of a network to support each other and to share some ideas and share some very concrete actions or something. I can answer questions if you want and tell you more, but I keep it like that. Thank you.
Thanks, Alexandra. It was a genuine privilege to actually hear you speak from the heart, and very practically as well. I'm going to go to Mary Hamilton now, who's, I suppose, at the other end of the spectrum, in that you're not a freelancer. You're somebody who's actually managing these issues as they manifest within a very large suite of newsrooms that The Guardian operates as audience editor. Can you talk to us about your approaches and your concerns?
Sure, I can talk a little bit. So About 18 months ago, a colleague of mine, Becky Gardner, who used to work with The Guardian, kicked off a piece of research called The Web We Want, in which we, that kind of involved multiple different strands, but we published a swathe of journalism looking at the issue of harassment online, and looking more broadly at kind of discourse and the state of discussion on the web. And as part of that work, The Guardian looked internally. We looked at our own comments. And so we have a data set of about, I think at the time it was about 60 million comments that had been left on The Guardian website under articles. We looked at those comments, and we looked at the moderation decisions that had been made on those comments. The Guardian's always had comment moderation. We've always chosen what we retain to publish on the site. And we looked at the rates of moderation blockings underneath certain stories by certain authors. We looked at every author that had published, I think, more than 2 articles on the site during that time. And when we ran the numbers, we found that the largest numbers of comments that had been blocked, the authors that were the most abused, effectively, looking at the Guardian's own criteria for abuse, of the 10 people where the block rates were highest, 8 were female, and neither of the 2 men were white. Now, The Guardian doesn't see death threats on our site, like rarely, if ever, and when they do exist, they are taken down immediately and the perpetrator is permanently banned from the site. We are strict about our moderation policies. But even in an environment where the harassment that we see is relatively limited in scope compared to what can happen in places where there isn't that consistency in moderation, we were still seeing the same sorts of patterns around gender, around race, around sexuality. And there are lots of people have raised a few quibbles with the way that that sort of research was carried out. There is an open question as to whether at The Guardian the people who are not white, who are not male, who are not straight, are more frequently asked to write about subjects that cause people to respond in particularly aggressive ways. And there is, I think, genuinely something for most news organisations to take a look at there about what is it that you're asking your diverse staff to write about when you're asking diverse staff to write. But at the same time, fundamentally, there's also something there for us to look at in the comment threads themselves. We've made a bunch of changes internally to the way that we manage our comments over the last year, including things like giving the moderators significantly more power to pick and choose where conversations are open on the site, and sort of enhancing some of their capabilities through machine learning as well. But one other element of the research was looking at the impact that abuse and harassment had on our journalists and on our staff internally. And what we saw consistently is that almost every journalist who writes online now is receiving abuse and harassment of some form. Most people come nowhere close to the sort of scale or the sort of severity that you've experienced, Alexandra. Nowhere close. But a lot of people do experience this drip, 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 drip of steady, demeaning comments. Like, personally, none of the threats that I've ever received have gone to the point of being actionable or being escalatable to the police, although I know that several of my colleagues have experienced those things. But there is still that steady kind of drumbeat of every time you post something online, what is the reaction going to be? And from talking to my colleagues, from working with other people in other newsrooms, what I'm seeing and what I'm hearing is women who are concerned to speak, concerned about saying anything, and especially women who are of more than one minority identity, who are concerned about discussing publicly the way that they live their lives in ways that their male colleagues don't struggle with, or certainly don't struggle with to the same extent. I think the other thing I'd say is, so I've been peripherally involved in video games journalism for quite a long time. So I was aware of Gamergate kind of as it happened. Do you guys all know what Gamergate was? I'm getting mostly yeses. So it was effectively it was a sustained campaign of psychological abuse against one woman that got way out of hand and eventually led possibly to the election of President Trump. It's a very complicated thing. But broadly speaking, what we see now increasingly is that the sorts of abusive campaigns and tactics that were developed through Gamergate, through forums like 4chan, and through sort of collectives of anonymous abusers, have been mainstreamed and have become something that journalists can now expect to encounter on a much more frequent basis. So the sorts of things like drawing spurious connections, creating extensive, wikis that purport to show conspiracies, and also the sort of whistleblowing kind of trolling tactics that Milo Yiannopoulos in particular was very well known for. People with very large followings who would say, this person has done something, and would then be able to completely disavow all knowledge of the resultant wave of abuse and harassment that would descend on the person that they were pointing to. And what we're seeing is that more and more groups of individuals are using these tactics more openly now that they're sort of perceived as in quotes, working as a way to silence and also as a way to discredit and render it much more difficult to believe the voices of authoritative journalists. We also think that we're seeing, groups of organised individuals related to government activity in some areas as well, especially around Russia. It's very difficult to prove that, but there are certainly some really interesting patterns out there in the data, and finding ways to address that. We can do a great deal within the confines of our own comment threads, but we can't at the moment meaningfully impact what happens to a journalist when they step onto Twitter.
Or Facebook Live.
Or Facebook Live, yeah. Or Periscope or YouTube. But Twitter is still, for us, I think, by far the biggest vector for abuse that most of our journalists get.
Okay, great. Thanks, Mary. We're going to pass the microphone. You've actually got your own. So over to you, Blanid. What are your experiences?
I think we're on, yeah. Where I'll start with this is by saying I'm not an expert in online harassment. I don't work day in, day out with our social teams, in the sense that I don't sit and moderate comments. I don't, work as a community manager, and I've certainly never worked with a journalist that has experienced the scale of what Alexandra has experienced. But what I want to talk about as a senior editor in an organization is that dealing with online harassment and dealing with trolling and dealing with the environment that people are, experiencing is not something that lives in a corner. It's not something that should be handled by one part of your organization and siloed into, a section where a group of people have to deal with it. It starts at every point of where you work with journalists, and at the point of when you hire them, for example, at the point of when you are commissioning them, when you are working on what an angle of a story is going to be, and you're taking responsibility for then when that journalist writes that piece and what happens to it. When we deal with online harassment as organizations, it can't be merely in a reactive way. It has to be something that is, 360, something that is part of our editorial meetings. And so where sort of, I suppose for me, my first interaction of what I would describe as, I think every journalist is sort of one story away from being it on the internet, and literally tagged, it at points when sort of the audience or a group of people will decide that they have such an issue that they will start to just really go after an individual writer or producer or correspondent. And for me, I learned that lesson very early on a much, a very small scale lesson, in the sense of when you all of a sudden experience the avalanche of people taking issue with what you've done on the internet. I was a student journalist at the time. I was in Northwestern, and I was sent to cover the White House Correspondents Association dinner as a student journalist. And it was at the time sort of the mid-2000s when George Bush's approval rating was in the 30s, and it was months after Hurricane Katrina, and everybody was just incredibly, it was a quite an atmosphere in the US at that point. And I remember filing what I felt was a fairly innocuous report on an evening which, if anyone's ever been to the White House Correspondents Association dinner, it's a very odd sort of event that brings, Washington and politics, together with journalists in this slightly strange space for an evening. And again, what I thought was sort of an innocuous report was posted on the White House Correspondents Association's website, and my college email was put at the end of it, and the invitation to email Blanid Healy at whatever my email address at that point in time was, in these mid-2000s, was sort of put out there. I don't think I certainly didn't know that was going to be the cue. And at that point, it was cue the onslaught of email. describing my reporting as terrible and idiotic and, everything under the sun. Because of course you're going to prompt reaction from both sides of the Republican side, the Democrat side, and just people who just had an issue with you. And at that point, for me, I think that stood with me and stayed with me in the sense of when I think about commissioning people, you have to, before you sort of. I don't think I would ever put something, out there without, in the sense of, email this reporter directly without really thinking about that. But also thinking about your commissions, talking through, especially with younger journalists, when you first hire them. And this was an experience when I was UK editor at Mashable before I joined CNN. Where you're commissioning around hot button topics, things like feminism, with a writer who worked a lot around relationships, sex, and dating. Obviously, things that before we hired her, you go through the process of talking through that the reality is that it's not just now you write a story, it goes out onto the internet, then at that point, that's when the reaction begins, the abuse can begin. And it's awful that we have to think about these things when you're in an interview process and you're hiring people and you're talking to them about these scenarios. And it's terrible that you have to think about it when you're commissioning. And it's dreadful that women have to think about self-censoring. And I feel incredibly lucky that I have had only these minimal experiences. And it's ridiculous that I have to say that I feel lucky that I haven't had other experiences. And that's where we are today. So my perspective on it, though, is I think we have to think about these things, really across the board. And as managers and editors, we have to be much more conscious of what is happening, thinking well ahead what happens when you become it, when our journalists become it on the internet and when people start going after them.
Absolutely, and we'll come and unpack some of those examples of practical actions in a moment. But over to Hannah Storm, who runs INSEE, the International News Safety Institute, and where these issues are emerging as new elements that represent threats.
It's really interesting. We've been having conversations over the past few years since I started work at INSEE in 2010. And originally, the kind of traditional notion of safety was very much the man going, and it usually was a man, going out to a war zone with his flak jacket. So he had the physical kind of robust resilience already there for him. I think in about 5 years ago, it was around about the time that Lara Logan was attacked in Tahrir Square. Some of you may be aware of that. I became much more aware of the way that the physical safety can kind of drift over into an online assault. Lara was quite significantly attacked online and verbally because of the blamed, as Alexandra said, for the physical attack that happened on her. So we started doing a bit of work into looking into that area, and fast forward to today, it's one of the most significant areas of safety concern that we have as an organisation that deals predominantly with journalism safety, because it's so prevalent. This notion of online abuse and harassment, and as Vlad said, you're only ever one story away from being it, from being tagged, from being tormented, from being traumatized potentially, because actually the whole drip that we've heard can potentially become hugely traumatic. I just want to talk very briefly about a piece of work that we did at the International News Safety Institute about 4 years ago. It's called this. It's got a very long title, so I won't bore you with the title, but effectively it's a study into violence and harassment against women journalists. Sorry, I did bore you with the title there. But basically one of the key things that comes out there, a bit of a kind of headline, 1 in 3 female journalists have experienced some kind of harassment in their lives, so connected to their work. A lot of that was physical, a lot of that moved over to the sexual sphere. A lot of that, and this was 2013, 2014, so we were kind of at the early days of trying to understand the prevalence of online harassment and abuse. But it was quite clear, and I'm going to quote a couple of examples that people gave us. It was quite clear that people were experiencing terrible threats and abuse. So here's a lady from the United States, and I'm quoting her, for the nearly 5 years I worked as a technology journalist at a magazine, I was constantly criticized online. Often this had nothing to do with the content of my articles. I was called a whore for writing a negative article about Apple. People searched me online to come up with embarrassing information and posted it beneath my articles, and people often made belittling or sexist jokes as comments. The conventional wisdom to ignore comment sections did not apply because my bosses required me to look at and respond to comments. And that to me is really interesting because in the last couple of years, obviously we've seen management kind of get and understand a bit more how to broach the subject. But I'm still finding and having conversations with journalists around the world, ranging from India to New Zealand to Congo to Russia to Argentina, female journalists around the world who are dealing with this. They don't all have the backing of great organizations like The Guardian and CNN, so they don't know how to respond or not to respond, how to deal with it. And the interesting thing for me is, yes, we have brave journalists like Alexandra talking about her extraordinary, horrific experience. And we have journalists like Blanard kind of putting herself down and saying, you know, I haven't really experienced much at all. But I mean, that to me is the fact that we, and I myself, have experienced some. I self-censor quite significantly on Twitter because, quite frankly, I don't want to have to deal with it. I have a young daughter as well. I don't want her to have to deal with it either. But I guess what I'm saying is there is a significant scale of experience of people, and just because you haven't experienced anything that is a death threat, a rape threat, being called a whore or a slag or a slut or terrible, terrible words, have somebody threaten to put their penis in your mouth to shut you up, which is kind of the type of thing that people have threatened and said, that doesn't mean you haven't experienced online harassment, and that doesn't mean you haven't experienced abuse. And I think the thing, therefore I'll shut up in a moment, but the key thing I think is that a lot of the time journalists are not coming forward. So they're not saying there's a problem. So it becomes this thing that they're having to deal with themselves, and it becomes quite isolating. When you don't know who your attacker is, it's extraordinarily isolating. When you're living with that drip drip, you're constantly kind of, as Alexandra said, you've got this echo of these words in your head all the time. And the particularly potent thing with Twitter, I think, and with Facebook and with social media is the second you wake up in the morning, you're very, very vulnerable. Who doesn't turn on their phone as a journalist? All of a sudden, you've got this abuse in your face, on your phone at 6 o'clock in the morning, and you don't have that emotional flak jacket. You haven't got the physical flak jacket. You're not necessarily prepared. I will just stop just by finally saying I am really concerned as to how, as a society, we are going to try and support younger female journalists coming into our industry when they are faced with the potential onslaught of abuse and harassment, which will turn them away from something. Media reflects society, and society is reflected by media. Without those kind of voices, we can't have an adequate reflection of what's going on in the world, and that is an extraordinary challenge, I think, for us to deal with in the next few years.
Thanks, Hannah. I'll just very briefly add my own personal experience to this mix, because I think there's an elephant in the room, and that elephant exists in the context of media organisations fueling the harassment that other journalists and citizens can experience. And so my own story of online harassment includes nothing as extreme, again, as Alexandra, but, being called a hairy-chested feminist, having sexualised comments, loads of comments about my appearance, all of those things that are just awful. But the worst experience I ever had as somebody surviving online harassment, if I can put it that way, was in 2010 when the Australian newspaper, which is the Murdoch Press's flagship publication in Australia, decided to run a campaign against me because of reportage I did from a conference citing one of the Australian's former journalists criticising her editor. And it was an early example of the kind of pylon that we're describing, fueled by right-wing commentators online, as well as those who are actually journalists. And I think, therefore, it's important to acknowledge that we have a responsibility, those of us who work as journalists, in thinking about the implications of the kind of campaigning journalism that can occur, targeting individuals for political expression, for example. So that's just a flag. I want to come to your questions in just a moment, but I just want to turn the thinking process to how do we deal with this problem. We've heard some examples of the need to address risk through commissioning, really important, and not something that we're seeing nearly enough of. So if you're doing, a series of stories for some reason on return of kings, on online harassment groups, like groups that exist to abuse women, what are the potential consequences? Who is going to suffer the impact of that kind of journalism within your newsroom? That's one example. And some of the other examples we heard include, proactively dealing with people's lived experience of online harassment, acknowledging the problem at very senior levels, for example, and ensuring that there are processes in place to assist with going to the police in cases that are actionable. So let's turn our minds to that. But I want to see within the audience whether there are questions that you'd like to put or experiences you'd like to share. Okay, we've got one here and one there. Do we have a microphone that can actually go around? You're going to take this one? I think here.
Thank you. I am Gülsün Harman from Turkey. Last year, I did a project for International Press Institute tracking down digital threats, including online harassment against Turkish journalists. And as you may not be very surprised, the huge chunk of the online harassment is addressed to female journalists. So going back to some of the points you already made, dripping that you have mentioned, and in Turkey, the online harassment against female journalists is mostly coming from state-sponsored actors. And it totally changed all the context. So fighting back the trolls, and one thing that Alexandra put also very importantly, in Turkey and in other countries also, but mostly in Turkey, the trolls have names. They are sometimes in the very high level of the power, they are pro-government columnists, they are editor-in-chief in the pro-government media outlets, so they have a name, and that's why the chilling effect is so strong also on female women, because I did a feature about interviewing a few female journalists, and none of them has ever gone even to a prosecutor office to file a complaint, because they know so well that if I complain, I will get even more online harassment and a very disturbing, the exchanges with the government itself. So they refrain from it. So. And it was a great panel, thank you so much, and hearing from all the stories from around the world, that it's a kind of a relief, but kind of a support that to know that it happens everywhere. But so I have to put a question also to you. So to fight back online harassment and to form like support networks and the others, but when it comes from the higher levels, approved by the very consistent and sustainable campaign by the government, how to fight back and what are the ways to deal with it? And is there a way to form a very international coalition and bringing together the women? Thank you.
Yeah, I'll let Alexandra say something, and I'd like to add something to that too.
Thank you so much for telling us about your experience and what's happening in Turkey. I totally share your perspective and your view, and that's exactly what I wanted to say, that these are not trolls. Many of them, and the most powerful and significant, they have names, they are like members of parliament, and they are like famous artists, and they are the ones that are responsible for opening Pandora's box. For like normalizing and mainstreaming misogyny. The problem is that it's very hard. I mean, I read there's the biggest financial newspaper in Sweden. They printed that an artist called me a moron. They just printed his tweet. And it's exactly that. How can we fight this when it comes from such a high level? We always talk about Trump here, but I mean, Trump is not alone. There are so many Trumps out there that are like totally give the green light to this hatred. So we should really find a way of, and mostly, I mean, I would really like editors and everybody to, people with a lot of media power to do something about this. I don't know.
Yeah, I'll just add that in forming this panel, I had a discussion with Blanet's colleague Inga Torra, who's here from CNN as well. And we had the express objective of trying to get a network of journalists and editorial managers and civil society organisations together to tackle this issue. So it's something we want to do, and if it comes out of today, brilliant. You know, there's been discussions around the periphery, but let's continue the discussion about how we do that outside after. You know, we can march down to a cafe if you like, but let's actually do something about it. Mary.
I think I'd just say there's a lot that we can do to support each other, and there are a lot of kind of tactical things that can help to address the immediate issues. Those things don't necessarily help to address the balance of power, but they're still important because fundamentally, so a lot of the work that I've done on this has intersected with work around vicarious trauma and people's exposure to, for example, images of death or of traumatic events that have serious psychological impact. And actually a lot of the remedy of both of those things, a lot of the things that you can do to support and to address those things are quite similar. They're about acknowledging that there is a problem and collectively finding space and time to support other people who have gone through similar things and to be supported by those people. Just the very fact of having a group of people around you who can say, yes, what you're experiencing is real. Yes, it absolutely sucks. Yes, you know what? Sign out of your Twitter account. I will monitor your email for you for 3 days while everything goes to hell, and I'll pass on anything you absolutely need to see. There are these tactical things that we can do to support each other that don't necessarily involve law enforcement, that don't necessarily go to addressing the balance of power, but that do help people to remain resilient and help people to remember that what they're experiencing is genuine, that their feelings are real and supported, and that actually it's possible to find care and community with each other even in the face of stuff like this.
I'm going to go to the next question because we're running out of time rapidly. I think there was a question here before, and I can see one up the back as well. I'll come to you next.
Hi, thank you for the great experiences. I'm a Bulgarian journalist. I report on migration. There is a huge backlash against refugees and migrants in my country. Therefore, it goes on the journalists who report on the issue and who do not do it in a negative sense. So I've received death threats, all kinds of stuff online, but I also cover the nationalists in my country, so it became creepy when I go to there, and I'm a correspondent, I'm alone in my country. So I tried to interview some nationalists at one of their rallies, and they told me in my face that I'm scum, and they would not, and when you see physically that they know you, and it's dark and you have to leave and you don't have the car of your media because you're alone, it's really stressing. So I honestly want to ask you, in such a case, what is the more effective tactics? I started talking openly about it, writing blogs, etc., but I don't feel safer. I mean, I'm lucky that I have a lawyer boyfriend who takes care of my stuff, but it's personal and it's not done by my employers. And isn't self-censorship after all more safer? I mean, some of us choose not to, but I don't know what to advise other colleagues. Maybe I would tell them just not to do such stories.
I mean, I think this is, because you're working, as you say, on your own, this is the challenge, and this is, I think, where other organizations, and we can hopefully find something out of this in terms of working collaboratively. I don't know if this is happening, you're finding the bulk of this is happening to you on social platforms. Is it something you're experiencing for the most part on a specific social platform, or is it happening just in every part of your life? Mix, yeah.
It's mostly online, but I'm not the only one. I mean, I don't want to victimize myself, and it's even, many people who work on human rights issues or migration, etc., in my country are exposed to that, and
everywhere. It's
yeah.
like,
yeah.
If you're a Muslim woman and you're black and you're talking about refugee issues or politics.
yeah.
It's part and parcel of what you deal with. Yeah, and I mean, and you can't self-censor. We can't become that. We can't do that. This is, you know, these issues need to be reported on, the voices need to stay strong, but then you can't be on your own either, you know, just taking the bulk of this back at you. You can't sort of put yourself out there as the only person who's gonna have all of this coming at them. And I think that comes to, how do we work more collaboratively? How do we work with people who are out working as freelancers? How do we bring them more into the fold of our community? How do we then work with platforms to try and find solutions? You know, and it comes back to, if platforms can find solutions around pulling down copyright material, for example, they seem to be able to do that very well, and other things, you know, and we work with them, I think, as an industry, you know, on how do we optimize and for engagement and for views and for whatnot, but we have to collaboratively now pull together, not just on behalf of our own organizations, but on the most vulnerable people who are freelancing and who are working on their own as individuals, and find solutions, ultimately.
Sorry, I just need to go to another question, sorry, because we're really running out of time. We've got a few minutes left, and I promised yes up the back. And I just say the training word, that's a really big part of this as well, like collaborating on training and capacity building. Thanks.
Good to see you. Alexandra, Michelle Ferrier from the United States. I'm Michelle Ferrier. I'm a professor at Ohio University, and I'm also the founder of Trollbusters. And we have 3 sessions today talking about online harassment, and ours is later on this evening. But I only had enough handouts from my session, but I wanted to let people know Trollbusters is working internationally to try and support women journalists who are facing online harassment. And we've done work, I think a lot of the work that needs to be done is proactive. In protecting yourself and locking down your identity, in browsing safely and making sure you're doing things to protect yourself and your sources. But also, I think one of the things we'll talk about this afternoon is the language that we're using to describe the activity that's happening. And there are different nuanced ways in which you should respond based on that. And so in January, we created a flowchart that says different kinds of threats that you're experiencing and then what you should do. So whether it's doxing or a distributed denial of service attack or a critique or an implicit or an explicit threat, we've designed this for the US, but we're also looking for partners to translate this and put in place the resources that are available in your own country to be able to help support journalists. And we've had interest already in translating this into Spanish and Arabic and Hindu. But it needs the local context.
Yeah.
It needs the local resources, because there are organizations working to try and do some of this work in places, and work with the platforms to try and find alternative routes for journalists and their success. And so I'd invite people to check us out, hopefully come get a handout, and I'd love to chat with you.
Okay, great. Collaboration happening in real time in this panel context. We don't have time for any more questions, I'm sorry, but we're happy to keep talking outside after this panel. We've got about 1.5 minutes, which is kind of, 15 seconds each to wrap up. I'll start with Alexandra and work our way to Hannah, if that's okay.
Okay. 1, 2, yeah. No, I think we should be tougher. I think we should support each other and show solidarity on an international level. But I think we should also, like you, in Bulgaria or wherever you are, you should address your government, the ministers, because this is about press freedom. You should invite others, victims of this verbal violence, of this horror, the daily terror, and you should go together and ask your government and the system what they are prepared to do. Because this is about press freedom, it's about freedom of speech. I mean, this is a fundamental right for everyone. And I hear you here, all of us, we say, I'm so sorry, I don't want to be a victim, because they stigmatize us, and make us feel bad that we are victims.
Blanid.
So I think it comes back to not sort of siloing this and not looking for silver bullets, right? This is something that needs steady, everyday work. And I think, that's something that we have to realize within our organizations, and also outside of them, supporting people who need that extra support. So, working with all parts of your organization to understand that this is part and parcel of what we do. It's just part of now society. It's something much bigger than just back to the experience you had in person. This is it goes beyond our platforms and beyond the internet, and just working collectively. I think that's really the only way forward, and linking up with Trollbusters and other organisations in truly kind of collaborative ways.
Yes, and I just say, on a practical organisational level, thinking about how you integrate traditional safety approaches, which Hannah's talked about, with your digital security people and your managing editors, and thinking practically about how you deliver some of the things we've discussed with locking down your profiles and providing support. And this is genuinely a workplace safety issue. So your HR departments, if you're in a news organisation, are increasingly experiencing journalists taking time off due to psychological trauma experienced through online harassment. It's real, it's costly, and perhaps that's what talks. So let's continue the discussion collectively and collaboratively, physically outside later, and also online. I think what we need is a forum where this can be discussed and debated.
I have a question for all the men in the room. Hello. How many of you, can you guys just put your hands up if you've received the sorts of harassment that we're talking about here? Okay, can you put your hands up if you haven't? I'd like to ask if all of you could possibly go to your newsrooms or to your colleagues or to people who you think maybe might have learned something from this panel today about what life is like for folks that do experience this sort of thing, and just tell them about it. And just make it clear that this is an issue that's important to you and that maybe it's something that they might care about too. I think for all the collective organisation that we do who've experienced this, there is still a huge barrier to get past between the people for whom this is just an everyday fact of life, for whom everything that we utter on the internet comes with a decision about how harassed we want to be today, and the folks who don't experience that, have never experienced that, and maybe don't ever have those conversations, that aren't ever in rooms like this. And actually, it's you guys who are here who've taken the step to come into this space. Thank you for doing that. If you guys can go away and actually tell some more people about that and start to kind of normalise the idea that this is something that's discussed openly and above board, widely, not just by the people who experience it, that could potentially have a larger impact than you probably realise.
I'll make it very quick. It's horrific that it's become normalised, but we have to accept the fact that we need to talk about it more. An industry meeting that we had a couple of weeks back, I had a moment where one of the people who is a very high up person in a bureau in London, there was a penny drop moment, and literally this person's mouth almost drops to the floor when they heard about some of the experiences, and it was completely like, I didn't even realise that was going on. So, as everybody said, collaboration is absolutely key. Thank you ever so much for coming, because the fact that you're here means that everybody is part of the conversation. So appreciate that very much.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks for watching, and thanks for tolerating the fact we've run over by a couple of minutes, even though we promised to finish early. So thank you. Yes, we are ready to start.
Bad internet connection.
Yes. So,
do you have a good
testing? Let's. Great. Hi, everybody, and thanks for coming to this panel, a really important panel, we think, and hopefully you will too at the end, on tackling trolls and managing online harassment. In the age of Trump, we're adding, because there is an actual connection to the escalation of the sort of harassment that's being experienced, particularly among women globally. It's going to be a difficult discussion at times, and it might bring up experiences that you would like to share, so we're going to try and get to as many questions as we can. I think it's really important to encourage an environment where people feel safe to acknowledge the kind of harassment that they might have experienced. So please speak up if you'd like to add something at any point. I'm going to start, though, setting the scene in a pretty dismal way, I apologise, quoting from an OSCE study from 2015 that examined the particular experiences of women journalists in terms of online harassment. I was raped in the imaginations of many men, and in so many different ways they've expressed their interest in doing that in person. Also, they've promised to do the same to my mother. That was just one respondent out of many to this study that was launched at the end of 2015. And I'm going to start by giving an overview of some of the global research and insights that have been curated over the past 2 or 3 years as this issue has become more traction-worthy, I guess, within newsrooms, but certainly within civil society as well. And it's really worthwhile acknowledging that we are in, a golden age for audience-engaged journalism, and that's fundamentally important. And we encourage our journalists and freelancers as well to be active participants in online communities as a way of distributing content, as a way of ensuring that there is a sense of agency for our audiences. But online harassment is indeed a growing problem. The discussion around the graphic sexism that was revealed in connection with Donald Trump, and I don't want to politicise this too much, but the effective licensing of the harassment of women that occurred with online harassment attacks on women journalists and women commentators, anyone who spoke up. The attacks began to be sexualised. So I don't think I actually introduced myself, which is hilarious. I've only had one espresso, so forgive me. I just realised that I'm talking about everybody else. My name is Julie Pizzetti. I'm an Australian journalist and academic, and I work at Fairfax Media, which is the biggest publisher of news in Australia. And in that capacity, I work there in the capacity of the lead on digital editorial capability. So these are issues that I'm not just researching and talking about, but also trying to respond to in a practical way through training. So let's get this discussion properly underway now that we've created that pretty depressing picture of global experience. I'm just going to ask each member of the panel for their reflections on experiencing online harassment, whether it be individually or in the context of a newsroom in the course of their work. And I'm going to start with Alexandra, who also has a video that I think we might see at some point. So Alexandra, the way you've explained your particular experience actually starts from having been a migrant child in Sweden and experiencing harassment from your upbringing through to your role in the newsroom. Can you just take us through your story?
Yes. Good morning. Would you like me to show the short film now, or? Yeah, we can start with it if you would like to hear. Does it? And what about the voice?
If you don't leave the country within 24 hours, we will kill you and your family. When this anonymous letter arrived through a letterbox, I was a 9-year-old nobody. I came to Sweden at the age of 6. My father was a Greek migrant, a cleaner. We lived in a suburb mainly inhabited by refugees and migrants, in a family without books or newspapers. My mother took the letter and went to the police.
It's an issue that is confronted by both men and women. We don't want to discount the fact that it's experienced by men, but as some of the evidence I'll present now demonstrates, it is much worse and frequently much more sexualised and violent in nature when it comes to women journalists. So the sexual harassment and the graphic threats of physical violence are the indicators for the kind of harassment that is typically experienced by journalists. Before I go any further, I just want to interview this rather amazing panel of women we've gathered here. We might at some point have a man joining us in the form of Greg Barber from the Washington Post, who's done a lot of work in online comment spaces. So if he pops up and starts to participate in the conversation, don't condemn him, he's been invited. But can I start at my right, Alexandra Pascalidou, who's a very prominent Swedish journalist whose story I will let her reveal when we get to this point. It is compelling, and I met Alexandra at a conference that the EU pulled together examining some of the issues in contemporary journalism, and I walked away in tears and with a sense of passion and urgency about this issue that I hadn't felt before. Mary Hamilton, to my left, who's a very experienced and high-profile journalist from The Guardian. She's the executive editor of Audience. Is that still your title at The Guardian? To my immediate right is Blanid Healy, who is the senior digital editor with CNN Digital, senior digital news editor. And last but not least, Hannah Storm, who's the executive director of the International News Safety Institute. So we're going to try and tackle some of these issues. We want ultimately to have a discussion that prompts action, that looks at solutions. But as I said, we need to scope the problem first. So the problem that we're talking about, particularly when it comes to women, is often described as cyber misogyny. So it can be expressed through online abuse and harassment, stalking, for example, but it's also potentially a threat that crosses over into the physical realm. And it's a genuine risk, whether it's online or offline, a genuine risk to journalists' psychological health as well as potentially their physical health. And I'm emphasising psychological health because for too long we've told journalists, just look away, it's not real, it's only on the internet. And I think that's something we need to acknowledge as a problem. It can be a particularly brutal experience for journalists, particularly women, who are reporting on feminist issues, tech issues, and Mary's going to talk a little bit more about this, politics, social policy issues. So if you're at the intersection of reporting on race and politics and you're a woman, you're more likely to be a target for this kind of harassment. There's an early quote from these debates from an email that Jezebel staff sent to executives at Gawker that really still resonates with me. One of the journalists says, it's like playing whack-a-mole with a sociopathic hydra. In other words, you just can't push that thing away. And she said, on behalf of her colleagues, it's impacting our ability to do our jobs. So from a newsroom management perspective and from the perspective of the role of journalism in democracy, this is a huge issue, yeah? So women feeling often that they need to walk away or that they have to withdraw either from online communities or from a particular round. Some of the research indicates that women are leaving the profession altogether or not entering the profession. And it's also causing women in audiences to pull back from participation and sources as well. So it goes on to affect civil society discourse and the sort of agency that's required for a civil society. So let's look at some of the research. There was a study, quite seminal study in this area from 2014 done by Demos in the UK. And it studied Twitter specifically and the abuse of celebrities. And what this study found was that journalism was the only category where women received more abuse than men, with female journalists receiving roughly 3 times the abuse levels as their male counterparts. I think things have shifted since then, but that's an early indicator of where the problem was emerging. That OSCE study, look it up, it's really helpful, it's full of detail, from 2015, found that among the journalists who were surveyed, 90 to 95% of the experience of harassment occurred online within that group. So, we spent several decades ago when I started as a journalist, we spent a lot of time and energy looking at physical sexual harassment and verbal sexual harassment in the newsroom. Still a huge issue, but this is the kind of statistic we're seeing in terms of online engagement. And the study found that female journalists, bloggers, and other media actors are disproportionately experiencing gender-related threats and intimidation and harassment on the web, and that it has a direct impact on their safety and future online activities. There's a range of recommendations from that study, a call to action for news organisations, for individual journalists, for civil society groups, and we'll get to some of those issues later. But to summarise the sorts of threats that they discovered through this research, they included death threats. They included the threats of rape and violence that we hear so much about. They included threats to harm the children of some of the reporters. Hacking through email and Skype specifically, and social accounts. One that's really troubling, and young journalists who I've taught previously are experiencing this through Tinder interactions, but the creation of fake profiles on dating sites designed to direct harassment at women journalists, for example. There were reports of dead bodies being sent to journalists. I have a friend who's a feminist writer in Australia who works for my organisation as a columnist, and she has received pictures, archival pictures of dead bodies as a way of trying to silence her, and that's revealed in this research as well. Also, blog posts, that go viral, defaming individual journalists, and even newspaper ads in some cases being taken out against the reporters following an onslaught of online activity. And one of the other interesting points was that the foreign correspondents who responded to this research talked about the fact that they knew they were at risk this kind of harassment physically in the field in certain contexts. They didn't expect to feel victimised in the way that they did when they came home to their domestic newsrooms. I know that we probably don't need much more, but just to highlight the fact that this is not an issue only confronting women journalists or journalists specifically, but the UN Broadband Commission found in 2016 that 3/4 of women online have been exposed to some sort of cyber violence, and they've urged governments and industry to work harder to protect women and girls online to ensure their participation. And an issue that we'll get to that has emerged since the US election campaign through the